G'day guys, back with you at a circle. This video is titled The Problem with an Imperium of Hope. And it's not just about the Imperium, although I think that is quite clearly the area where this problem is the worst, but it exists across 40k as a whole. For over 30 years, the universe of Warhammer 40,000 has fascinated many. It's been through 9 editions, it's sold countless models, novels, it's filled halls full of people who want to play events. But currently, at least for me, its story is just rotten at its core. What makes me say this? I mean, I know many appreciate the universe, so where does my attitude come from? Well, to start with, let's look at the community response to the background of the game, because the community response is telling. The first place to look is the divisiveness of the background. Say what you will about your own personal preferences. It's fine to like it, it's fine to loathe it. But I think it's safe to say that since probably the end of 7th edition, there has been a growing wave of a vocal discontent with the background. It's easy on the surface to say that this is due to some vocal minority, or that people are just angry nerds, but I think that's really issuing a bit of a disservice to people. The problem is too widespread. Too many similar arguments pop up in far too many locations for it to all be coincidence. There are so many views, it's really hard to call it all some concerted effort by trolls. No, I think the issue actually lies somewhere around 2016's Wrath of Magnus for beginning, and the real tonal shift for the system starts with the featured Gathering Storm. So I attribute a lot of these problems to when Kevin Roundtree steps in and takes over from Tom Kirby as CEO, which happened in 2015. Kirby, for those who don't know, was the long-term owner of the company, very much a business-as-usual type. His tenure saw a very lethargic Games Workshop which sat on its laurels until financial issues began to mount. Kirby, his departing opened up the door for a new, more energised company under Roundtree, where things have changed up. It's important, in fact it's very important to note that change isn't a bad thing. The obvious strawman argument to a video like this would be one similar to what critics would say about The Last Jedi and the criticism it received. You hated the stagnation, you complained that everything was the same, and now you complain that something is different. Well, to put it bluntly, that is a gross simplification, because it doesn't look at why something isn't working. It's only looking at one part of the equation and attributing all of the criticism to that one thing. In Tom Kirby's tenure, for example, the worst things that ever happened in the background happened mostly around 5th edition. You had Kaldor Drago and his background stories carving his name to Mortarian's heart and such. That was pretty eye-rolling. You had things like the Necrons, so the complete rework of the Necrons from cold, mindless killers into sort of Tomb Kings in space, where there are personal empires and things like that. And very divisive. Some people think that it's great, some hated it. You've got the team up of the Necrons and the Blood Angels. You have the Grey Knights covering themselves in the blood of sisters of battle. You know, those sort of things were divisive, but that's about really the worst of it, and that was 5th edition. You're talking the around 2011, 2012 period when a lot of those issues began. That's pretty far into the game, considering it came out in 1987. So that's really it. As an issue of background, there's not much else you can say in that time period. But under Roundtree, however, well, you have the Wrath of Magnus 1 year after he comes out as the CEO, which is a half-cooked book where the Thousand Sons of Magnus, who have sat for 10,000 years scheming, just plot petty revenge on the Space Wolves for actions which Magnus long forgave them for, and in fact allowed to be inflicted upon him 10,000 years prior in the first place. That was followed by the Gathering Storm, which is where Abaddon destroyed Cadia, which didn't really further his plans in the end, and Guilliman is awoken by preposterous circumstance. This further is worsened as the community didn't have time to react to this sudden huge turn of events. After 30 years nearly of relative stagnation and similarity in the universe, this is a huge change. It's a lot to take in, and before they could digest it, a new addition was thrust upon them, and an already questionable character introduced in the Gathering Storm, Belisarius Cawl, comes front and centre, just delivering an entire new range of Marines. And these special snowflakes are superior to the old fan favourites in every way. And rather than getting a gentle introduction, the background overhyped them, and the gameplay, well, it set them clearly apart from their contemporaries. Within a span of a few months, more had happened in 40K's universe than in the last 30 years. That's a lot to take in, and it's hard to swallow if written well, but this was arguably written very, very poorly. So, to cite one example, I'll use the Gathering Storm series, because again, I think it's really the point where the problem became endemic. So in that, you get an Eldar character who worships a new Eldar god who can revive the dead. The supposed reason for this is that this particular god can potentially free the souls of the Eldar from an eternity of torment at the hands of Slaanesh. Okay, interesting plot thread. Are we going to explore that more? No. Then we get introduced to a new mechanical character, and he's on Cadia to help with the defenses of the planet against chaos. And when it all goes pear-shaped, he flees with the Eldar, which is unplannable in the first case, and ends up in the Ultima sector, alongside your average D&D party, the Paladin, the Zealot, that kind of thing. But they aren't on Macragge. They're on some other planet, and it just so happens that some Ultramarines there fighting chaos. Lucky for them, they catch a lift to Macragge, even though they're Xenos, but whatever. And when they get there, they find Macragge fighting an overwhelming Chaos incursion too. Chaos has an entire galaxy they apparently are now free to attack, and rather than striking with force towards Terra, or some planet close to the Eye of Terror, such as Medusa or the Rock, they send a force across to the literal opposite side of the galaxy after the Ultramarines. Anyway, they land, and this dubious party, including Xenos, are allowed into the innermost sanctum of the Ultramarines where their Primarch lies dormant in stasis. Thanks to Tigris, they are granted access as he constantly vouches for them, and the Magos reveals he's there to revive Guilliman. But since when? He was on Cadia to help in the defense of that planet, across the other side of the galaxy. He wasn't aware that the Eldar would take him through the webway to Macragge. Anyway, he pulls out some armor that he apparently hides up his waste disposal receptacle, and then they literally cut the preserving force field off. Then the Eldar say that they need to invoke a ritual to revive him. So, wait, was that in Call's plans? Does his armor not work then? Did the wound healing itself for 10,000 years not actually matter? Okay, moving on. The Eldar Ritual requires deaths to occur in order to revive him. So, who are you going to sacrifice? But then, just as you're getting to that point, a Thunderhawk loaded with traitor marines slams through the roof into the chamber, and the deaths of these Black Legionnaires at the hands of the Ultramarines and the D&D party are sufficient for the ritual to work and Guilliman is revived. So that is one segment of the story, and who here thinks that was a good story? Who doesn't think that was entirely convoluted? And who here thinks that they just slapped new plot and new motives onto those characters as they wrote the books? There was clearly no plan to that, and they just said, fuck, we need something to happen here. How does it happen? This person makes it happen. Clearly. The change that occurs in the book, it's really just two things. Guilliman's revived, Cadia falls. Those two events work as a narrative, but the way they happened does not. It's no different to Luke Skywalker dying. Nobody cares that he does. It's how and what leads to it that matters. This is endemic across current 40k, specifically the Imperium. Take, for example, the Blood Angels. The Blood Angels were heroic because they kept going despite the universe seemingly being against them. The Red Thirst, the Black Rage, an irradiated homeworld, a Tyranid hive fleet bearing down upon them. They don't rage at it, they don't wallow in self-pity, they rise to the challenge and meet it head-on, despite the odds. That's heroic, that's engaging, that makes you want to play Blood Angels. The Imperium itself is saddled with dying technology from a time they no longer understand, slowly regressing, losing more technology than they gain each year. They're mired in superstition and religious dogma, paranoid of their own worlds turning against them. It's dark and it works. Sure, there are some worlds within that are a paradise despite this, such as Macragge, but others, like Necromunda, embody some of the worst traits. That's an interesting setting. The threats to the Imperium, they evolve constantly, and whilst the tools at the Imperium's disposal worsen with time, much of their best tech is lost or it was sabotaged during the heresy. Famously, for one example, the Imperial Army used to use land raiders in the Great Crusade. But during the Siege of Mars and Terra, the traitors stole the land raider STCs, corrupted what was left behind, and took what was good in their long retreat back into the Eye of Terror. The few remaining land raiders became relics, and they were given to the chapters of the Astartes alone, taken off the mere basic humans. And what few were made since then are of limited variety, and it makes the defense of the Imperium with such lackluster equipment more heroic and more impressive, raging against the dying of the light for 10,000 years. But with the many changes in the background that forward progression has brought us with 8th and 9th edition, these aspects are forgotten. A heroic last stand doesn't count for much if there's not only a replacement army ready to leap in and amend any losses. What's worse is if the replacements are simply superior to the originals. You've gained, you haven't lost. I could see it working if there were green recruits jumping into combat, but the supposedly green Primaris Marines still manage to kick all the ass because they are just superior to the old Marines. I'd say that doesn't work as a narrative. Then you have the equipment. The technological regression and stagnation is completely flipped on its head. So what are the stakes in the universe now? Powerful technology that can turn the tide of the battle was once restricted by its relic nature in 40k. Now, it's capable of being manufactured fresh. Imagine it's in real life, and you're the Germans and you're losing World War II. You're still producing the same Messerschmitt fighters you were making in 1936. Modified, but it's the same airframe. And somebody drops 10,000 Me-262 jets, 20,000 Panther tanks, and 1 million fresh elite troops, and all the resources to support it into your hands. It kind of changes the stakes of the war, doesn't it? They wouldn't rest idle now, the Germans, if they suddenly got this windfall. No, you'd bet your ass they would keep producing new tanks and planes in spite of all this. Well, that's what Call has done. He introduced new troops, he introduced new technology, and he sat on it. All the great perils that beset the Imperium in that time, the War of the Beast, Armageddon, the Black Crusades, the different hive fleets of the Tyranids. There should be untold millions of brand new tanks that he has stockpiled over 10,000 years that are waiting to be handed out. It just makes no sense. And this is the issue with the universe now. This is what needs to be fixed about 40k. You can say it's science fantasy, you can make up some excuse about continuity not mattering. That's true for certain individuals. But the system and the novels are based on a universe that is an alternate future to our own. It has to have a foot in reality at all times, even if it's just the tip of the toe. And breaking that tiny bit is what ruins the immersion. If the background means nothing, then it's just a game. If the background means nothing, why have one at all? Why invest yourself in the stories, in the characters? Because it just doesn't matter at that point. If you want to play it for just a game, great, you do you. But the universe is so interesting, it's a shame to ruin it all. I'll leave you with one last thought, detached somewhat from the rest of this episode. It's hard to answer, it's sort of semi-philosophical. And it was a response I had to a comment that was made on a previous video. But it's this. Who truly owns an IP like this? By law, it's Games Workshop. Sure. But that company, it invests in the future of it by handing it to staff members who have no experience often in the universe. They therefore don't love it, understand it, or the constraints of it quite often. Do you, if you're like myself, a nearly 30-year-long fan, with tens of thousands of dollars invested in it, have to accept that? Just because they have been granted by random chance the arbitrary power to create the canon, doesn't mean they have the right to do so over the original creative vision. Ignore the legality of IP law. After all, it was once legal to beat your wife. Legality isn't a measure of moral right or wrong. If they write bad fiction, are we obliged to support it just because they nominally own it? I'll leave those thoughts with you today. I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Let me know what you thought of this video. I'd love to hear your feedback. Do you agree with me? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think The Gathering Storm is the greatest literary masterpiece since War and Peace? It's not. Let's just get that out of the way. But you can pretend it is, and I'd love to read the defenses of it, because I'm sure they'd be great. Apart from that, I will see you all on the next one.